Think of the last time you saw a child raise their hand in class. Was it a single action or part of a larger pattern? Welcome. In this segment, we'll break down the foundational concepts of behavior, response, and response class, which are essential for the BCBA exam because they form the building blocks of how we define, measure, and analyze everything we do as behavior analysts. You'll learn to distinguish a single instance of behavior from a broader class of functionally similar actions, understand the 4 key dimensions for analyzing response classes, and see how operational definitions ensure accurate identification. We'll compare behavior versus response class, highlight key distinctions, and give you practical tools to apply these concepts on exam questions. By the end, you'll be able to identify whether you're looking at one response or a whole class, a skill that directly supports tasks in domains B, C, and F of the 6th edition TCO. Let's break down 3 foundational terms you'll see on the exam: behavior, response, and response class. Behavior is any living thing's activity, including private events like thinking. If a dead man could do it, it isn't behavior. A response is one specific instance of that behavior, defined clearly so you can count it. A response class, however, groups together topographically different responses that all produce the same effect. Function is the glue. For example, saying please pass the salt, reaching for it, or pointing are different responses but belong to the same response class if they all get the salt passed. On the BCBA exam, you'll need to distinguish topography from function and write operational definitions that let you measure and replicate data accurately. Master these distinctions now because they underpin everything from preference assessments to intervention design. Knowing whether you're tracking a single response or a whole class of functionally equivalent behaviors directly impacts your database decisions. On this slide, we're clarifying 3 foundational terms that often appear on the BCBA exam: behavior, response, and response class. Behavior includes any action of an organism, observable or internal, that can be measured, like talking or reading, and the dead man test reminds us that if a dead man can do it, it's not behavior. A response is a single instance of that behavior at a specific time, such as folding one shirt or answering to a math problem. How you operationally define the behavior determines what counts as one response. A response class, by contrast, groups together topographically different responses that all produce the same consequence, like saying stop, pushing away, or leaving, all of which end in interaction. Understanding these distinctions is critical for exam questions on measurement, functional analysis, and designing function-based interventions, because you'll need to identify whether you're tracking individual responses or a class of functionally equivalent behaviors. When analyzing a response class, the BCBA exam expects you to understand that behaviors grouped together share a common function despite looking completely different. This is topographical diversity. For example, a child might hit, scream, or run away, yet all 3 responses could serve the same purpose of escaping a task. That functional equivalence is the core. Each response produces the same environmental consequence, like gaining attention or avoiding a demand. This creates a measurement challenge because you cannot simply count a single form of behavior. Instead, you must track the consequence that maintains the class. For intervention, reinforcing one response within the class can inadvertently increase other members of that class. So extinction applied to one topography may not eliminate the entire class unless you address the maintaining consequence. On the exam, you may be asked to identify which responses belong to the same class or to design an intervention that targets the function rather than the form. On this slide, we're clarifying a critical distinction for the BCBA exam: behavior, response, and response class. Behavior is any activity of an organism, like folding laundry, that a dead man cannot do, so it's a general class of actions. A response, however, is one specific instance of that behavior, such as folding one particular shirt. Think of the unit of analysis. Behavior is a broad category, while a response is a single occurrence you can count. For measurement, you track overall occurrence or non-occurrence for a response class, but for a single response, you use frequency, rate, or duration. The key exam point here is that if a dead man can do it, it's not behavior. So sleeping or lying still wouldn't qualify. But a response depends entirely on your operational definition. If you define folding one shirt clearly, you can measure it precisely. This distinction helps you avoid confusing broad patterns with specific instances on test questions. To ensure accurate identification during data collection and analysis, BCBA candidates must master operational definitions that clearly differentiate behavior, response, and response class. This slide emphasizes that each definition must include observable, measurable criteria, such as arm raises above shoulder height, so that any trained observer can reliably record occurrences. Including explicit examples and non-examples reduces ambiguity for RBTs and other team members. For instance, specifying that a response includes only completed hand raises, not partial movements. For response classes, the focus shifts to function. Topographically different responses, e.g., tapping a peer, calling out, are united by the same maintaining consequence, such as teacher attention. Avoid minimalistic terms like wants attention, because radical behaviorism requires language tied directly to environmental events. Finally, test your definition by having two independent observers apply it. If they agree on whether a response occurred, inter-observer agreement is strong. On the BCBA exam, expect questions asking you to identify or correct flawed operational definitions, so practice writing clear, function-based, and testable descriptions. On this slide, we're clarifying a foundational distinction you'll need for the BCBA exam: behavior versus response. Behavior is the broad category, like writing behavior, which you measure by its presence or absence across time. A response, however, is a single, discrete instance, such as writing one word on a page. You'd count its frequency, rate, or duration. The key is that behavior depends on a general activity definition, while a response requires specific operational criteria, exactly what you'd write in a measurement plan. For the exam, you'll be asked to identify whether a given activity qualifies as a behavior, e.g., aggression, or whether a single event is a response, e.g., one hit. This distinction matters because it affects how you define, measure, and track client progress. Master this, and you'll avoid confusing broad behavioral classes with their individual instances, a common error in test questions and real-world data collection. To identify a response class, you begin by observing multiple topographies, different-looking behaviors like hitting, yelling, or crying that occur in a similar context. Next, you identify the common consequence each topography produces, such as escape from a demand or access to a toy. The critical step is confirming functional equivalence, verifying that all these topographies reliably lead to the same consequence, meaning they serve the same function. Once confirmed, you define the response class operationally as all responses that result in that specific consequence. For the BCBA exam, this process is essential because it moves you beyond surface-level descriptions of behavior and into functional analysis. You'll need to distinguish between a response class, behaviors sharing a function, and a mere collection of topographies. Exam questions often ask you to identify which behaviors belong to a response class based on their common maintaining consequence, or to design interventions that target the entire class rather than individual topographies. Mastering this process strengthens your ability to conduct effective functional assessments and develop function-based treatments. Let's clarify the distinction between behavior, response, and response class, because the BCBA exam will test your ability to identify each. Behavior is a broad category of actions sharing a common function or topography. Walking, eating, reading, talking, and writing are all examples of behavior because they describe general classes of movement. A response, however, is a single instance of that behavior, taking one step, biting one piece of food, or reading one sentence aloud. Think of it as one specific occurrence you can count. A response class is a group of topographically different responses that all produce the same effect on the environment. For the exam, you must recognize that gaining attention can be achieved by yelling, tapping, or waving. Each is a different response, but they belong to the same response class because they all result in attention. Similarly, escaping a task might involve crying, throwing, or leaving the seat. Mastering this distinction helps you accurately define target behaviors and design effective interventions. On the BCBA exam, distinguishing between behavior, response, and response class is a common source of error. So let's clarify these pitfalls. First, remember that a response is a single instance. Saying hello once is a response, not behavior. Behavior is the broader class of similar responses over time. Second, never ignore function when identifying a response class. Two topographically different behaviors, like tapping someone's shoulder and calling their name, can belong to the same response class if they both produce the same consequence, such as gaining attention. Third, without clear operational definitions, observers may disagree on what counts as a response, which harms data reliability, a critical issue for exam questions on measurement. Finally, do not assume topography defines a response class. It is defined by a common consequence, not similar appearance. For the exam, expect scenarios where you must identify whether responses are in the same class based on function, not form, and ensure your definitions are precise to avoid inter-observer disagreement. On the BCBA exam, you'll need to understand that these distinctions directly shape how you design and evaluate interventions. Targeting the right unit means deciding whether to focus on a specific response, like raising a hand, or an entire response class, such as all forms of requesting attention. Function-based treatments hinge on this. Reinforcing one response in a class can strengthen others, while extinguishing a single response may not eliminate the whole class if other topographies still produce reinforcement. Measurement accuracy depends on correctly identifying responses, so your data on frequency, rate, and duration truly reflect the behavior of interest. Task analysis development requires you to break a complex behavior into individual responses, which demands a clear distinction between behavior and its component responses. Finally, generalization planning reminds you that teaching one response may not automatically transfer to other topographies in the same response class unless you explicitly program for it. For the exam, expect scenario-based questions where you must apply these principles to select the most effective intervention or interpret data correctly. On this slide, we're comparing response class and stimulus class, two concepts that often appear on the BCBA exam because they test your ability to distinguish between what the learner does versus what the environment presents. A response class groups together different behaviors, like hitting, yelling, or crying, that all produce the same consequence, such as escaping a demand. The unifying feature is the common outcome, not the physical form of the behavior. In contrast, a stimulus class groups different environmental events, like a red light, a stop sign, or a police hand signal, that all evoke the same behavioral effect, such as stopping. Here, the focus shifts from topography to the shared function across stimuli. For the exam, a key tip is to look for the same outcome from different actions to identify a response class, and the same behavioral effect from different stimuli to identify a stimulus class. Mastering this distinction helps you correctly analyze functional relations in scenarios, a critical skill for scenario-based questions. To master B.1 for the exam, you must distinguish behavior, response, and response class with precision. Behavior includes any activity, observable or internal, that a living organism does. If a dead man can do it, it's not behavior, which helps you rule out non-examples on test items. A response is a single instance of that behavior, defined operationally so you can measure it accurately, like one hand raise rather than vague terms. A response class groups topographically different responses that produce the same consequence or serve the same function. For example, saying "excuse me," waving, or tapping a shoulder all get attention. On the exam, always identify response class by common consequence, not by how responses look. Function over form is key. Practice with clinical vignettes where a client engages in diverse behaviors, like screaming, hitting, or eloping, that all lead to escape. The exam will ask you to identify which behaviors belong to the same response class based on their shared outcome, not their appearance. As we wrap up, remember that mastering the distinction between behavior, response, and response class is foundational for the BCBA exam and effective practice. Behavior is the broad, measurable set of actions sharing a function, while a response is a single instance, like one tap of a switch. A response class groups topographically different responses that produce the same effect on the environment, such as saying "please," pointing, or handing over a token to gain access to a reinforcer. The key takeaway: you must identify the function, not just the form, to design meaningful interventions. Avoid common pitfalls like confusing response class with stimulus class. Stimuli evoke responses, but response classes are the actions themselves. On the exam, expect scenario-based questions testing your ability to classify examples accurately. So, commit these definitions to memory, practice with real-world examples, and remember, precision in these terms leads to precise, ethical behavior change. You got this. Keep drilling those B1 concepts until they're second nature.